Just think of the news today when drones strike with precision, that aircraft loom across a battlefield, controlling supplies and ammo dumps. Think about the rockets that strike hundreds of miles away at targets that are designed to strike back at the enemy. Those concepts of air power, whether it be a drone, whether it be a fighter, whether it be a strategic bomber, it does not matter. All those concepts were in the mind of a man known as Billy Mitchell. And he was so far ahead of everyone else's thinking about air power that he ran into quite a bit of mischief, because he was an individual who knew he was right. And so he insisted that everyone believe the same thing he believed. And of course, that does not do well when you're in the United States military. So anyway, here's a fascinating story. And General Mitchell was, of course, an aviation pioneer who advocated the greater use of air power as a key component of the United States national defense. He pushed aviation theories that are now looked upon as regular activities that we do in the military. So once again, as I said, he was a great visionary. Now, Mitchell was born, and this is not when he was a baby, but just to let you know, William Leonard Mitchell was born in Nice, France on December 29, 1879. His father was an extremely wealthy senator from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His paternal grandfather was a Scottish immigrant, and he actually created great wealth for his family, creating the Milwaukee Road Railroad, as well as establishing the Marine Bank of Wisconsin. His father, of course, that was Alexander Mitchell. And so his father actually served in the Civil War. And serving in the Civil War, he actually worked with a man known as Arthur MacArthur. And we're going to make those connections in due course. But actually, they fought at the Battle of Stones River together. Mitchell's father was a cartographer, and he relayed messages that saved the day for the Union and enabled Arthur MacArthur to put his brigade in at a certain moment where victory was assured. So this family were extremely dynamic. And so younger Mitchell went to Racine College at age 14, imagine that. And then he went to the Columbian University in Washington, D.C. However, then, or today, it's known as George Washington University. But so he's well educated, but wait, he resigned or quit school because the Spanish-American War comes, and that yellow press motivates many people to want to join in this step for America to become a world power. Mitchell joins as a private. He's going to be assigned to Luzon in the Philippines, and guess who's commanding that sector of the U.S. occupation of the Philippines? Then Brigadier General Arthur MacArthur. And of course, so very quickly, he gets promoted to second lieutenant. I don't know if his father had anything to do with it, but I bet you. It's never written as such. And he's named a second lieutenant in what's called the Signal Corps. Now, the Signal Corps existed since the Civil War, and really it's about ciphers and wigwags, or semaphore as we call it, and the use of telegraph. So during the war, he performed his duties well. When the war was over, he stayed in the regular army, and he'll be assigned to Alaska. And it's called the District of Alaska at that time. And he developed a communication system that linked U.S. Army outposts, gold camps, towns throughout that wilderness of Alaska, and which will connect all of Alaska with Tacoma, Washington. It's called the Washington Alaska Cable and Telegraph System. So notice the need of proper communication, rapid communication. Now, just so happens on this day in 1908, Mitchell is at Fort Myer, Virginia, where he witnesses Orville Wright do a flying demonstration. No one understood aircraft and what it could do at that time. And of course, the Wrights recently proved flight was possible. And Mitchell was so amazed at what he saw that he decided that aviation would be the key to the future of U.S. Army operations. Now, this is 1908, and he's in the Signal Corps. Actually, they'll set up an aviation section of the Signal Corps, which is more for relaying information as well as observation. Now, in the meantime, Mitchell is going to be assigned to the Philippines, where he will go and visit the battlefields of the Russo-Japanese War. And he mulls upon it. He notes the rising power of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army, and he will say that they will be fighting us for control of the Pacific. Well, he comes back to the United States, and he was appointed to the General Staff, one of 31 officers. This guy is 36 years old, and he's appointed to the General Staff and the only Signal Corps officer on the General Staff. And this means he will have a perfect position to start to spread how we want to. Now, this is Spanish War, sorry. So what will he do? He will be there, of course, as the temporary head of what's known as the aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And of course, he wants to, well, if you're going to be in charge of the aviation section, don't you think you should fly? Well, guess what? He was too old and too high of rank, he's just a major, to take pilot training. So what does he do? Every weekend, he comes down by train in 1915 to take lessons at the Curtis Flying School. It looks like one of them's yawning there, but I know it was far more exciting. Mitchell will spend $1 a minute, and you had to take 400 hours of instruction to receive your Aero Club of America license. Oh, gosh. And so he does that. His first solo flight, those of you who live around here, he has trouble with his airplane, and he lands on the middle of Washington Avenue in downtown Newport News, and his plane ends up right in front of a soda shop, and he jumps out and he says, I want a soda. As if nothing happened. Nothing bothered this guy at all. He had nerves of steel. The Curtis Flying School, of course, was created by a man known as Glenn Curtis, aviation pioneer, who actually begins the pioneering of seaplanes, believe it or not. And much of that work was done right down at the small boat harbor here in Newport News. So it was important. So many Canadian pilots will come down and learn how to fly. So Mitchell is very empowered, and he's now assistant director of the aviation section of the Signal Corps, and he is going to be assigned to be an observer in France to see what's happening with this new war, how aviation is changing the battlefield. Well, he arrives in France and is there on April 6, 1917. We all know that date. That's when the United States declared war on the Central Powers, Germany and Austro-Hungary and Turkey. And Bulgaria, to throw it in. So anyway, he's there, and he establishes the office of the U.S. Aviation Section. and he begins to really rise in importance. And so he will become the most outstanding American combat aviation commander during the war. He was the first American to fly over German territory. Now, he was an observer in a French-piloted SPAD, but that's okay. He likes SPADs a lot. He gets promoted to lieutenant colonel. Then he gets to be promoted to full colonel. And everyone in Europe is beginning to realize his dashing and daring leadership that he's sharing with everyone. So guess what? He gets promoted to brigadier general. And during the offensive in September of 1918, which is the Battle of St. Mihiel, he will be in command of the entire Air Force. That is the combination of American, French, British, and Italian aircraft, 1,500 planes. Now, here's a guy just learned to fly, 3 years before. So this is amazing how he takes to these tactics. And his tactics was, how do we control a battlefield? The Germans are retreating, they're in assailant, and so we got to cut that off. How do we do that? Carpet bombing. And also by disrupting transportation systems with our fighters and these light bombers they had developed. So Mitchell has this concept that, wow, I think it's still used today. And he was so good at that, that's the largest concentration of air power in history to that date. So Mitchell, of course, is, once they do that, then they get involved in what is known as the Muse Argonne offensive. And once again, Mitchell in command of these joint flights of aircraft, and which he mixes bombers, light bombers, and strategic bombers. And strategic bombers back then were two-engine, open cockpit type, but still they could reach out and disrupt the battlefield. So he's doing it in a series of echelons, which impresses everyone for him to come up with a concept. In fact, he becomes very friendly with Sir Henry Trenchard, nicknamed Boom Trenchard, because he likes strategic bombing. And so the impact of the Muse Argonne offense is that every day there is going to be flights totaling 200 to 300 planes strafing the enemy, bombing the enemy, medium bombing the enemy, and as well as, of course, bombing in the deep distance of the enemy. So, we are reaching out in every way. Oh my gosh, I got to tell you, war's end, Mitchell, along with his good friend Eddie Rickenbacker, are the best known American airmen in Europe. He ended the war as Chief of Air Service, Group of Armies, and with the dual title of Chief of Air Service, Third Army, and that's the rank he held at the armistice. Now, he received all these decorations. It's unbelievable. He is brave, he's forward-thinking, he's doing everything you need to transform this new style of warfare into reality. So he receives decorations galore, including Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, Order of St. Michael and St. George, the French Legion of Honor, Grand Office of the Order of the Crown of Italy, the Italian Order of St. Maurice and Larzès, Italian War Merit Cross, the French Croix de Guerre, and 1 silver star with 1 silver palm and 3 bronze palms, the French Verdun Medal, and the World War I Victory Medal with 8 campaign bars. This guy is hot. There he is, so this is when he comes back to the United States. Now, when he comes back to the United States, he already thought that World War I was not the war to end all wars. He realized that, you know, nations had to really start to develop new concepts of aircraft because he believed aircraft controlled the battlefield. Now, not everyone agreed with him on these concepts. And I have to say, he became a very strong supporter of a separation of the independent U.S. Air Force and unified control of air power. The Navy didn't like that. The Army didn't like that because he's suggesting a whole new branch of service. And so his concepts from the very beginning are opposed by the Army General Staff and as well as the Navy High Command. So he claimed in one hearing, now remember his father used to be a senator, he's a multimillionaire, he's a hero, and so everyone, the press, many congressmen like to listen to whom? Billy Mitchell. They're tired of all that droll stuff coming from the superannuated admirals and so forth. He's a bright star. So anyway, he will, when the Air Service is reorganized, he will be named. He thought he was going to be in charge of the whole Air Service when he came back, but instead in June 1920, he's going to be promoted Colonel, Regular Army. He's going to be named Assistant Chief of the Air Service and reappointed as a brevet Brigadier General. Okay, that's a big deal. Actually, by this time, they're calling him provisional. So he's got a temporary rank. And so anyway, so in that position, he continues to have serious disagreements because he makes this bold statement. Why are we building aircraft carriers? Because I can, with one plane, sink a battleship. Well, you can imagine everybody complaining about that. You know, even the people at Newport, shipbuilding, the Navy, you name it. They liked building battleships. And battleships were the king of the seas in many ways. So Mitchell began involved in all these disagreements. He said the construction of battleships is a waste of American resources, and that he believed instead of building battleships, they should begin building more planes and aircraft carriers. You know, now we have one aircraft carrier in our service. By 1920, it is known as the Langley, which used to be a collier known as the Jupiter, and was transformed into aircraft carrier at Norfolk Naval Shipyard. So that's the first aircraft carrier. And Mitchell really doesn't really think about these aircraft carriers because they're so small. He thinks with land-based aircraft with improvements to engines and range that they could sink any threat to the American shores. Now, you know, this is radical for him to say these things, and he was a radical guy. So what he does is he pushes for improvements to aircraft. He has people at NASA create the first bomb site, right? He creates he has people invent superchargers for the planes. He also has a wide variety of improvements made for these aircraft. And so it is really amazing. Now, so the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, and the Secretary of Navy, Josephus Daniels, agree that, yeah, we'll have some joint Army-Navy exercises. The Navy doesn't really want to do that with the Army, and especially with Mitchell. So what do? They take this ship known as now, Mitchell's going to be based, his unit here at Langley Field. It'll be the First Provisional Air Brigade. Now, and this is one of the bombers he's going to use. It's known as, it's a Martin. Martin Marietta is a descendant of this company. It's an open cockpit, you know. So now, so what does the Navy do? They want to cheat. So they take this pre-dreadnought battleship They take it off of Tangier Island, and they have a fake demonstration where they drop sand bombs. So the sand bombs do no damage to the superstructure. However, they have explosive charges underneath it, so it sinks like this. They say, well, those airplanes can't really do anything. The New York Times and the Washington Post get wind of the sham, and they demand a real exercise be completed. So Mitchell is going to assemble the first, I'm sorry about the quality of this picture, but this is really a great one. I don't know what happened there. So he's going to assemble the 1st Provisional Air Brigade, 125 aircraft, and 5,000 men at Langley Field. And this has observation squadrons, fighter squadrons, bomb groups. They're going to use several types of bombers. Now, they're going to use a Hadley Page 0400 made by Great Britain. They're also going to have the Caproni CA-5 bombers. And then they're also going to use more SH-5. Those are British fighters. And so what's going to happen is that he has all the bombs, fuses, bomb sights, and other equipment tested at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And he uses this ex-Imperial Russian pilot known as Alexander Seversky, and who actually fought during World War I. He got shot down, lost a leg. They say, you can't fly anymore. He says, yes, I can. He has a special leg made so he can still fly. He actually sinks a German ship from the air with his aircraft. And so, of course, Mitchell knows all about this. He's all excited. He brings Seversky to Aberdeen, where they test everything. And then they bring the force down to Langley. Now, meanwhile, the Navy says, okay, well, we'll give you a chance. And they allow these strict regulations that the Navy is going to operate under. Number one, they say they're going to be anchored ships that with each pass, you have to stop and let us go inspect. Now, that's kind of not the way aerial combat's supposed to be. So anyway, on June 21st and July 13th, 2 German ships, the Frankfurt, which is a light cruiser, and a destroyer called the G-102, will be placed out 50 miles out into the Chesapeake Bay, 100 fathoms of water, so they won't be wrecks so that will cause navigation hazards. But you got to realize you got to go from Langley 18 miles, another 50 miles, so it's a 70-mile flight. And that's a long way for the aircraft at that time, but Mitchell did not care. He had to prove his point. Can you imagine on July 18, you would see in the air over 100 planes flying from Hampton over Norfolk and disappearing out into the bay? That would have been the most amazing sight. We have problems with planes flying around us today, but guess what? In 1921, this is like unbelievable. It shows the power of a new style of aviation warfare, or a new style of warfare. So anyway, so they first, what his plan was, first the ships will be strafed by the fighters. And the fighters were equipped with light 30-pounder bombs that were anti-personnel. So they strafed the top of the ships and caused some damage. But then, I have to tell you, they will come back and strike with their heavy bombers, and the Frankfurt will sink. Well, the Navy says, well, that was just luck. So what Mitchell had done has understood that it's not so much striking a ship in the middle of the deck. It's really dropping high explosive bombs right next to the ship, because what that will do is crack your plates, and when your plates crack, guess what you do? You leak and you're going to sink. So anyway, so on July 20th, 5 Martin bombers struck at the Ostfriesland. Oh my gosh, it's so exciting. That's what happens to the Frankfurt. You know, the Navy says, that's just luck. So this is the near miss of the Ostfriesland. This is the concept. First we strafe it, and so we get rid of all the personnel on deck so they can't fire anti-aircraft guns. Remember, these ships are motionless, they're anchored. And after every action, every flight, you're supposed to wait for the Navy to go on board and inspect. Well, Mitchell on the 20th, too bad you guys. And so he strafes it, hits it, and then he has a flight of bombers that are going to he has 15 bombers come in waves over the Ostfriesland, right? And of course, they're trying to break the plates. They actually have one direct hit, but the big thing is, after the 5th sortie over the Ostfriesland, one of the observers will say, she's sunk. And without a doubt, after that last 5th bomb striking right next to the hull, the ship will turn turtle and go down. Well, what do you think the Navy says about that? Well, they were stationary ships, and really, they're kind of old, so it doesn't really count. So this is a great cartoon, because Mitchell has captured all of the popular opinion about new air warfare. So look at this. This is my favorite cartoon. Look, it's a defenseless ship, so what if you sank it? But the bottom one is really it. But we did sink it, didn't we? And so that's the message that we have to share. Now, so all these excuses come. Actually, Pershing doesn't like Mitchell. Mitchell didn't go to West Point, all this stuff. And so Mitchell's proof was proven, but Pershing's going to put out a report and says, well, it's unclear whether in combat situations this will really have an effect. So anyway, additional tests are going to be completed in 21, 23. Look, this is a phosphorus bomb over the Alabama. I don't want to get there yet. I get excited. Believe it or not. So Pershing once again issues a report, but Mitchell has his own report, which he leaks to the press somehow. And so, Mitchell's now the darling of the future of warfare. This is at the very same time they're about to have the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which is going to limit the building of battleships, which actually is something that Mitchell is advocating with great passion. Now, so Mitchell's proven all these things. However, there's this terrible miners' riot known as the Mingo War out in West Virginia. They're having pitched battles, and so Harding sends Mitchell to go out there and put an end to it, because Mitchell says, I can stop it from happening, because he knew he could bomb the rebellious miners, shows what side the government was on then, bomb the rebellious miners with tear gas, and that would force them all to surrender. Well, by the time he gets there, he's not able to do it because they had already surrendered. But the big thing is, he said it showed the potential for using aircraft in quelling civilian disturbances. It's kind of a disturbing thought. So what he does next is he's going to go on a tour of Europe right when they have the Washington Naval Treaty. They don't want him as assistant director of the Air Service making lots of noise. So he goes to Europe. He actually writes a book called The Command of Air. He meets with a lot of leading aviation experts in Italy and Great Britain. And in 1924, to get him really out of the way, he sent on an inspection tour of Asia and the Hawaiian Islands. Upon his return, he writes a book known as Wing Defense, where he predicted the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, he didn't quite understand aircraft carriers yet, but he said from fixed positions, fixed islands, that the Japanese, because of improvements in, engines and distance, that they would be able to attack Pearl Harbor and destroy our Pacific Fleet. Well, in March of 1925, Mitchell term as assistant chief of the Air Service expired. And so he got reverted to his regular permanent rank of colonel. Big embarrassment for a guy like Mitchell. And he was detailed to San Antonio, Texas, as the air officer there. He's taken out of the political spotlight. Now, I have to tell you, Mitchell was indeed a man of action and totally believed in his air power concepts. As I said, he wrote the book, Wing Defense. The thing is, he may be a powerful darling of the press and able to give meaningful speeches, but his Wing Defense book only sold 4,000 copies. And so not everyone could grasp everything that he was saying. So Mitchell's there in San Antonio, and he called it Out in the Wilderness. He became incensed by two major aerial disasters, the loss of 3 seaplanes and a flight from San Diego to Hawaii, and they crashed because of mechanical failures. And then he was even more incensed by the crash on 3 September 1925 of the Uss Shenandoah. Now, the Shenandoah was a rigid airship made, floated by helium, and it was really 420 feet in length. This is a huge dirigible, as we would call it today. And the idea was that it's great observation. It's also capable of bombing. So the Navy was very proud of the ship, so they sent it on all these wonderful, promo tours. And so in late August of 1825, Captain Lansdowne, who was commander of the Shenandoah, said, well, look, we really shouldn't fly in late August and September because of thunderstorms, because of tornadoes, all these bad things that make you, with a rigid airship, susceptible to a lot of problems. Well, the Navy said, oh, no, we got a schedule. You're going to follow it. Well, without a doubt, the Shenandoah gets caught in a line of squalls and fierce thunderstorms, where an updraft sends it up 6,000 feet, and another downdraft drops it down 9,000 feet. That force causes the airship to twist and come apart in 3 pieces. Well, I have to tell you, Mitchell issued a statement right after this, saying that the senior leaders in the Army and Navy were incompetent and that they almost had a treasonable administration of national defense. Now, I got to tell you, if you're an admiral and a general and you got this guy saying those things, what happens to you? You're going to get court-martialed, and without a doubt, he will be. Just as a side note, when the Shenandoah wrecked, the farmers where the ship fell parts on, they said, well, you can come on my farm and see it for $1. And if you want to get a drink of water, you can pay 15 more cents. And if you want to take a piece of the Shenandoah with you, that's $2.50. So, it's a gruesome little event. And so anyway, Mitchell will be called that he has 8 specifications. I guess the Article 96, and under direct order of Calvin Coolidge, then president, that he is going to be charged with violating Article 96. So Mitchell gets as his lawyer a congressman known as Frank Reed, and who initially said it's unconstitutional, that it would be a violation of Mitchell's right for free speech. 13 judges were assigned to this, and one of the most interesting ones was Douglas MacArthur. Now, Douglas MacArthur, second here. There he is in court. So, anyway, MacArthur said it was one of the most distasteful orders I've ever received. Among those who testified in Mitchell's defense would be Eddie Rickenbacker, Hap Arnold, Carl Spaatz, Ira Aker, Robert Olds. You think of those names, who led the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II. Those very people. They learned from Mitchell what the future of warfare would be like. However, the court will decide in a vote of 12-1. Douglas MacArthur was the only vote against charging Mitchell. In fact, he said that a senior officer, for being at variance with his superiors in rank and with accepted doctrine, should be allowed. Remember, he's the guy that argues with Harry Truman and loses his job. So, maybe he's doing that in justification for his future. But nevertheless, he is going to be found guilty. He will be at first suspended from rank for 5 years without pay. Cooley says, well, he was a World War I hero and did all these other great things. So what we're going to do is give him half pay. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, half pay does not work for a guy like Mitchell. And of course, only one guy could play Mitchell, and that's Gary Cooper. I don't know if you all seen this film, but it's great. And so after the war, now I got to tell you, Mitchell's private life is a little crazy. And he almost gets committed to a psychiatric hospital, believe it or not. Here he is on his 120-acre farm, the Boxwood Farm, outside of Middleburg, Virginia. He had gotten married in 1903 with his first wife, Carolyn Stoddard, and they had 3 children. It was a very happy marriage at first. However, his behavior becomes more and more erratic as a result of his heavy drinking. During the divorce, they have all these psychiatrists says, yes, he's crazy, yes, he drinks too much. This is 22, so here's the guy saying these things, and doctors are saying he's crazy. So he has to pay a lot of money to his ex-wife, but then he goes 1 year later and marries Elizabeth Trumbull Miller, who seems to like to drink with him. So anyway, the big thing is that Mitchell did not witness the vindication of much of what he stood for. Had Mitchell lived through World War II, he would have seen the fulfillment of many of his prophecies of air warfare. Strategic bombing, mass airborne operations, strategic importance of Alaska and the polar regions, and the eclipse of the battleship by the airplane. Those are all things that Mitchell believed in. In fact, his impact on aerial warfare, they call him the founder of the U.S. Air Force. And he will receive posthumously a Congressional Gold Medal. And they don't rescind his court-martial until the 1970s. Why, I'm not sure, but I have to tell you, he's the only aerial officer who has a plane named in his honor, is the B-25 Mitchell. And you can see it's a very unusual aircraft. It's a medium bomber, but more importantly, it also was an air support weapon. In other words, you could load in anti-tank gun or cannons, as we call them, and be able to control the battlefield. And that was all about what Mitchell had taught us. Taught us about saturation bombing, taught that the aircraft could control the battlefield to enable those ground troops to advance and achieve victory. So that's Billy Mitchell. Thank you. Whoa. I'm always lazy with my slides. You already see me.
But we want people to be able to find you.
Oh, help me.
So we have question from the room, do we? Yes, sir, right here.
What were the circumstances of his death?
He had clogged arteries, basically, and he was giving a speech in New York City, and he dropped and he was pronounced dead on arrival, and that was in New York City. 1936, February 19, 1936. He was actually in his late 50s. So, but
died
today,
early, yeah.
Well, I have 7 stents in my heart, so just think if they didn't have stents back then.
That's true. That's true.
This
is true too.
Well.
Oh yeah, I got a question. Did it ever come up when these admirals and people who were against them, did they come up with a concept or an idea such as, well, that's great that you sunk a stationary ship, but most ships don't. They go in fleets, okay? Number one. And number two, they're moving. They're not stationary targets. Number three, they're firing back at you. Did that ever come up?
Well, I got to tell you, at first, battleships then had very limited anti-aircraft protection. That's something that they learned by the 30s to add to ships. So that's an issue. Anti-aircraft gunnery is really a 1918 development. Moving ships, if you have bomb sites, if they're moving and you're moving, the bomb site's going to enable you to sink anything. And so that's, and when they did the test, Mitchell had aerial torpedoes. Navy said, oh no, you can't use those. So the technology that he starts to develop or has other people develop it will result in the Nordrum bomb site during World War II. And so, yes, you can handle anything moving with the proper equipment. It's just like shooting a duck, And there's the duck, and he's going to be there. So, maybe that was a bad analogy. But,
Kira, do we have an online question? We'll come
Yes.
back to the questions from the room in a minute.
Fantastic. Yeah, we've actually got 3 questions online. First is Carolyn Kent. They say the U.S. service sent out teams of pilots and photographers after World War I to survey bombed sites in occupied Germany and determine if it was a day or night raid. Do you know if any of the material collected is available?
Well, it depends on who collected it. It could be some items from the Imperial German Air Service or can be found in the Imperial War Museum. There's some items that are in the Imperial Australian War Museum. Even the seat from Baron von Richthofen's plane. So they're so smart at the end of the war that at the Australian War Museum, they actually sent a guy out, and when he came back from serving in the trenches, they took off his uniform, and it still has all the mud and cake on it. It's terrible. So I have not researched that, so I can't say for sure. If I were to start doing that here in the United States, I'd actually start with NASA and then go to the Air and Space Museum, National Archives, and then I'd actually go to the Imperial War Museum. I know they had bomb sites, night bomb sites, using Zeppelins. Now, because they bombed England at night. So I just never have researched it, but I'm sure it's out there because they did do exactly that. They wanted to know what those Germans were up to because they had done so well during most of the war. They ran out of food, ran out of men. And so, because it's a war of attrition. So, yeah, I think that would be a very interesting research topic. So for someone to pick up, I think I'm kind of busy now.
Another one?
Yes, we've actually got quite a number. So next is from Kenneth. He says, I have heard that when the Navy tests weapons on a target ship, they start with similar weapons first so they can on board the target ship and study the damage done. They then move up to larger weapons, inspecting after each round of attacks until the target sinks. So did Mitchell do a disservice by pressing attacks and sinking the Ostfriesland rather than allowing the ship to be inspected to see how much damage could be done by 1 or 2 bombs?
I think he did, but he wanted to prove his point so badly. The Navy then countered that, well, yeah, you're hitting next to the ship and that's breaking the plates. However, if you had an effective fire control party on board, you may have been able to stop the leaks. So we have no way of telling because you sank the ship. Now, Mitchell was a type of person who, I would say an excitable boy. Here he is proving his point, and he wanted to do it in a dramatic fashion. So yes, he did a disservice, and you're quite right about the towed targets. Towed targets, I mean, they used to do that all the time here in Hampton Roads, believe it or not. So yes.
Thank you. Do
we have another question from the room? Yes, sir.
Right. Show your B-25 again.
Well,
Isn't
technical.
that
The Mitchell.
That's the Mitchell. Isn't that the plane that was used to bomb Tokyo right at the beginning of the war?
It is not the plane itself, but it is the plane used. Yes.
Yeah, because that was
That's
full
Doolittle's
circle
raid. And Doolittle
and taken off out of aircraft carriers.
Doolittle knew Mitchell, and they had a relationship. Actually, right after World War I, Mitchell, as assistant director of the Air Service, prompted his pilots to go out there, and they used to have races, right? And Jimmy Doolittle is one of the leading racers. They used to do all sorts of stunts. And why? Because we want to take our planes to the edge so we can start to prove what is needed for the future of warfare. So you're quite right. That is the type of plane that was used.
So we have Jack Jordan from Yorktown. He says, did Mitchell have anything to do with the founding of the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base?
No, he did not.
Okay.
But he does have an airport in Milwaukee named after
Well, that's
him.
because he's from Milwaukee. But yes.
And one in Frisco, North Carolina, too.
Oh, well, that's an important one.
That's a big one. That's a big one. Absolutely.
We did actually have a question from Tom Graham saying, what was the story of his bombing tests off Frisco, North Carolina?
Well, those were when he did the Alabama and several other old American ships. And so he just proved his point. He tried different types of bombs on those, like phosphorus bombs, anti-personnel bombs. I mean, it is, it's just to further prove his point that there are different ways to sink a battleship, and that, and so he does that with, the Alabama is the one I showed here. There it is. Mm-hmm. He actually sinks the Virginia, the USS Virginia, that's right, and the USS New Jersey. Those are pre-dreadnought type of ships. So the Navy said, well, they're not as armored as well as our current ships. They always had lots of good excuses. I like the Navy for that during that time period.
Well, and that looks so much like Orville and Wilbur's, the wing and
there is a lot of difference.
Well, but to the uninformed, it looks a lot like it.
Yes, well, they had developed monoplanes during World War I, and but they weren't real. Monoplanes didn't really supersede biplanes until the 20s, and
an open cockpit.
They kept
bomber.
open. We had a U.S. Army aircraft. It was called the Pea Shooter, and I think we produced it in 1932, and it was an open cockpit. Yay, And,
Crazy. Another question, Kira?
Yes, so Jim Ullman wants to know, how did he earn a living after the court-martial?
well, he was a multimillionaire.
So he
You
did.
know,
He had a
his
huge
dad left him a
horse
couple
farm.
of shekels, let's put it that way.
Even after the war?
Well,
Yeah,
he still had enough to, you know, I mean, he was a spendthrift and everything like that, but I don't think.
Well, they had a huge horse farm there in Middleburg.
Well, 120 acres and shit.
Well,
no,
not so big, I
that's
guess.
really impressive.
But
And
they were into
yes,
their horses.
his family was extremely wealthy, and
Mhm.
so you know, he could withstand. In fact, he was offered half pay, and he goes, "You're not going to do that to me. That's an embarrassment." And so there you have it.
Well, yeah.
So nice.
Any other question from the room here? Yes, sir?
This is somewhat more of a broad question, John. You referenced 1917, the U.S. entry into World War I, and World War I was 1914 to 1918, last time I checked. And
It's right.
right, but the point being, if the U.S. had not entered the war, could Germany possibly have won the war? I've heard from people that, quote unquote, it didn't end correctly, and they marched they had 2 million men in arms and marched back to Germany or close to it. So what is your comments about what could have
Well,
happened?
let's put it this way. German strategy in 1917, put forth by Ludendorff, is to go ahead and starve out England by unrestricted naval warfare, defeat Russia, and if Russia's out of the war, 1.5 million men that are serving there, guess where they get to go? To the Western Front. And so they did exactly that, and they gained all this territory. In fact, Ukraine, Belarus, that would have all been Germany. And so basically, the German army was then pushed to the limit by several offenses by Ludendorff. They will reach within 70 miles of Paris, enough to use their heavy guns to actually bombard Paris. But the big trouble is that they shot their bolt. They had to do that before the Americans arrived. They didn't expect really the Americans to declare war as quickly as they did. They also did not expect America to be able to mobilize so that within, 14 months, we're in the combat theater fighting. And so Germany didn't expect that. And that was a bad gamble on their part because they had made a couple bad calculations, unrestricted naval warfare. You all probably know about the Zimmermann-Telegraph when they said, Mexico, you want Texas back, California? Well, join with us and you can get it back. And so anyway, that was it was a miscalculation on Germany because Germany, once again, is starving, right? Because they can only grow 4/5 of the food they need. So that one last fifth has to be imported. They may have conquered the Ukraine, but they had not been able to develop it as a food source for their own nation. And so it's the lack of food. Plus, when you sign an agreement with Trotsky and Lenin, you know, and your troops are there talking to some of their troops, and of course the idea of we don't like kings, we want the people to rule, and so there became, actually in the post-war era in Germany, there's this high rise of communism. The Imperial Navy, German Navy, refused to go out to sea in October. They knew the war was ending, and they said, well, we don't want to fight for the Kaiser anymore. You know, he kind of led us down the wrong path. So, and actually there's a great communist revolt in Germany known as the Spartacus Revolt, right after the end of the war. So I think that Germany was collapsing from within because of attrition warfare. Had it been just the Allies, I mean Great Britain and France and Italy, Germany probably would have won the war. But in the case of the Americans, look, these Americans come over and say, yay, you know, we'll jump over the top, we don't care. Well, they learned soon to care, but the bottom line is, in like 3 months of combat, where we have almost 250,000 casualties. So it kind of tells you we were reckless, but we had the desire to save the world for democracy. Yeah, well, yes.
Here's a question for you, John.
Yeah, didn't Mitchell design the concept of fighter launch airplanes from decks of aircraft carriers?
No, he did not. That is Eugene Ely, who proves that you can. He did that right off of Newport News Point. And so the use of catapults and everything don't come until the real development of aircraft carriers in the late 1920s and really the 30s. So yes, you could land and getting off they actually put a deck on the Birmingham, and Eugene Ely says, oh, I'm going for it. And they saw us. Now people were betting on him making it, and some were betting on he's not going to make it. Yes, he is going to make it. I mean, it was a big thing in the daily press back then. So anyway, but the plane came off and then went. And so it was like, oh my gosh. Then he proved he could land on a ship in San Francisco Bay Harbor. So that is just the very beginning, but lacking catapults, he did not do anything there. He did not really understand aircraft carriers. And so he does not put that in his doctrine of naval warfare. He thought you could sink a battleship by merely being land-based aircraft. That's why he purported to say, well, there should be one system of air command so that you don't have to have naval aviation, you don't have to have Army aviation, you have to have an Air Force itself. And by land-based planes, you could defend America. So no, I wish he'd been that forethought, but I don't think he liked the Navy that much, and I don't think they liked him either.
Well, court-martial will do it for you.
The Japanese figured it out very soon. Now, the Langley did not have it. Actually, the Rourke Oil, the last carrier made by Great Britain during World War I, had a catapult. So it was still, and they were steam-powered catapults. I think Frank had a question.
Oh, I was going to talk about, you said that you went to the flight school on Argonne, you paid for it, and you said it was a dollar a minute.
Yes.
So $414.
$4,000 then to become a pilot?
So it's
Well, it would have been
$414.
$400 plus coming down.
A dollar a minute and then 400 hours.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So 60 times 400.
Well, then he had to be wealthy, didn't he?
He paid $24,000 to become a pilot.
Yeah, I
didn't
computed
care.
it wrong, Frank. Thank you for that. I had way underestimated.
Where was that at?
It's actually at the small boat harbor if you're crossing the Monitor Merrimack Bridge coming into Newport News, it had been directly to your right. And so actually at the end of the war, the U.S. Navy wanted to build the Naval Air Base there. And the people of Newport News says, oh, no, we got better things to do with it. And so they moved that air base over to Norfolk.
There you go. World's
Sometimes
largest.
we think well, sometimes we don't.
Kira?
Yes, we have our last two questions, but for anybody who's interested in some photographs of Ely's first launches, we do have some great photographs in the catalog, and I'll have those pulled up back here, and I sent them to the folks online.
Oh, great.
So y'all can check them out afterwards.
Thank you.
And you go to the very site,
Yeah.
which is right at where Salters Creek empties into the Hampton Roads, is actually the very site where the USS Minnesota ran aground during the Battle of the Ironclad. I always got this good Civil War in here somehow.
There we
But,
go.
thank you,
So,
Kira.
oh, of course. So Lewis wants to know, did Mitchell ever actually lobby for aircraft carriers?
No,
No? Okay.
not to my, it's not in any of his books. And once again, he was into this land-based aircraft.
Well, and then Tom Graham wants to know, were Mitchell's bombs dropped by hand, or was there a mechanical device?
A mechanical device, a release system, yes. The first bombing was during the Third Balkan War, I think it was, when they were dropping them. There's a picture of them just dropping them as they're flying, you're going, whoa. And the first fighters were actually pilots during World War I, 1914, flying by each other and shooting at each other, So, it's like, oh my gosh, but they changed how to do that quickly.
Is that in the movie?
No.
Darn, I wanted to see Gary Cooper do that.
I know, but I tell you, there are lots of photographs of that type of thing taking place.
Yeah. Well, it's been a great conversation.
Yes.
Honoring National Aviation Day and Orville Wright's birthday, and we appreciate your being with us today, online as well as here. John's next lecture is September 9th about what is Hampton Roads. We hear it called that, but there's a whole story going back to 1600 and something about why we're called that. Thank you. Knew you'd know. And then his next Civil War lecture is September 16th in commemoration of Hispanic Heritage Month. We will talk about the wonderful and interesting and very handsome David Glasgow Farragut.
Yes, he's the highest ranking Hispanic during the Civil War, full admiral. So.
And our evening lecture series is now available online for you to register. Our first one of those is September 22nd. You can come see it in person, or we'll also be live streaming. So please visit, sign up, come back, and we appreciate you being with us today. And thank you, John.
Thank you.